Hello, everyone. It's the man behind the curtain again. After making several futile attempts to combine audio with PowerPoint, I've had to go back to just uploading to YouTube. So here we are. I'll get back with the technical gurus and see if I can't try to solve these problems. But I'm sorry to be so late. It's entirely due to technical problems. Because I'm so late in posting this lecture, I'm going to push back the time period for the discussions 24 hours to Friday at 7 p.m. I don't mind, no big deal. And I apologize for the delays. So, of course, we're looking at a PowerPoint that I've also posted on D2L. It's the week 3 about Japan jumps ahead. Let's go on to slide 2. So first, a note about television and movies. I've included some of the better movies in the syllabus, but they're not these ones you see here. They're both TV series that came from novels. I've included the better ones in the course because video in general, whether it's movies or television or something else, has such a strong impact on popular perceptions of historical reality. And my goal is to help you to parse fact from fiction in these things. There's often a love story artificially injected into historically based films because that, after all, is what sells. That's not limited to Hollywood. It's also true of China. There's an example at the left here. But to wind up this digression, when educated people my age who have heard of the Tokugawa and the shoguns and so forth think about it, they're likely to conjure up this image from a TV version of the James Clavell novel Shogun, which I think was done maybe in the mid-'80s. The book, which came before that, was very well done, as were James Clavell's other books about Asia, including King Rat, which was based on his time as a British POW in Changi Prison, Singapore during World War II. A good spring break or summer reading when you're done with this course. Let's go to slide 3. Skip over slide 3. Talk about the Tokugawa legacy and how it led to the Meiji Restoration and therefore a very vital part of East Asian history. Slide 4. In 1800, there were 260 feudal lords, or daimyo, who ruled Japan at their own local levels. Each of them had their own army and administrative capital around a castle. The daimyo performed fealty to the shogun, who was in charge of the whole thing. The shogun had hostages who were provided to him in this system at his capital in modern-day Tokyo, which was then called Edo. The shogun was the emperor's military lieutenant, but in terms of power, he was really the emperor's jailer. If you watch the recommended movie this week, The Last Emperor, which is about China and is intended to give you a preview of the material that we'll review next week, there's a taste of this samurai-emperor relationship in one particular scene when Puyi, the last emperor from the Qing dynasty, has become a servant of the Japanese in Manchuria. The Japanese samurai class, however, treated their own emperor with much greater respect since he was thought to be descended from divinity. If he was inconvenient in his opinions, they simply ignored him, but they would never order him around as they did the Chinese emperor, who, of course, they looked down on. More about that later. The daimyo, to get back to the local fiefdom rulers of the time before the Meiji Restoration, The daimyo sent money and hostages to the shogun because that was the way to maintain peace and not have the roof cave in over them. Um, However, that threat waxed and waned depending on the military prowess and personality of the shogun himself. The Tokugawa shoguns were all of one family line. And like any lineage, there were strong and weak descendants. In the Beasley reading, the author identifies or underlines the difference between reliable and loyal Fudai daimyo and others who needed to be watched more carefully. Let's go on to slide 5. Just briefly, I want to make sure you understand that Japan and China have been at each other, at odds, over the great land bridge of the Korean Peninsula for a long time, for geopolitical reasons. China tried invading Japan about 1,000 years ago through Korea, and in the 1590s, Hideyoshi Toyotomi, the great daimyo who appeared to be about to ascend to shogun, did the same. But he lost that gamble when the Ming intervened by crossing the Yalu River in a counterattack. After Hideyoshi's death during this conflict, his side lost in Japan. Tokugawa Ieyasu won the great battle at Sekigahara and took control of Edo and Kyoto to the south, where the emperor resided. Go on to slide 6. The legacy of these wars with China over Korea was long-lasting. Many Japanese thinkers considered Korea to be within Japan's sphere of influence, while Chinese strategists and others thought quite the opposite, that because of the Confucian heritage that was shared, and because of the nature of their own emperor, that Korea and indeed Japan were in the Chinese sphere of influence. As we read 2 weeks ago, the officials who made up the elite in Korea had to pass through a Chinese-style examination system and were steeped in the Confucian classics on how to properly govern, and so were the Japanese elites. Their eventual shift away from Chinese thought during the challenge of the West in 1853 was a vital change. It did not, however, precipitate the drive to take over Korea. That was based on simple geopolitics. If China controlled all of Korea, it was a potential threat to Japan through Korea and vice versa. When Russian power moved into the region in the late 19th century, that complicated the equation, as did the American move into the region at the end of World War II. This leaves Koreans in 3 basic camps over history. This is a very rough statement. I'm not trying to be exact. Some Koreans are completely anti-foreign. Some are more careful in their assessment of history and the current situation and seek to do the best they can to maintain independence. And some are less discerning and, for lack of a better term, go with the flow. As with any other occupied people, there have been collaborators and there have been heroes. But to this day, the surrounding powers continue to watch Korea, looking for anything they consider to be a dangerous shift in the status quo. It's a very touchy situation. Let's go on to slide 7. So back to the main topic. You may remember from the first week that first the Portuguese and then the Dutch had a trading station in Nagasaki, which is shown in this illustration. Deshima, it was called. Today, Deshima is no longer an island. It's everything around it has been filled in. It's just a portion of the city, but it's being turned into a historical landmark. Anyway, just before the closure of Japan in 1635, the Portuguese were blamed for an uprising and were thrown out. The idea was that if they were thrown out, then there would be no more uprisings. A simple idea, but one that stuck at the time, and one that continued to stick over hundreds of years. After that, the Portuguese gone, the Dutch were able to fill in the vacuum and resume trade exchanges on behalf of the West, as well as act as host for Chinese trade exchanges. Japan had the equivalent of state-to-state relations only with Korea at this time, and it was conducted not through the shogun, but through the daimyo of Tsushima, who also controlled Nagasaki and this area where Deshima was. This lasted until 1799, but with the decline of Japanese copper and silver mines during the 18th century and the development of a handicraft manufacturing capability which took over, or really market, which took up the market previously served by Chinese imports of silk, that trade was reduced to a fraction of its former self in the 1800s. So this simultaneous decline in trade and decline in natural resources available for export, and of course Japan is now thought of as a place without any natural resources, was very important in the late 19th century as the country's economy turned toward manufacturing and gradually away from exports of natural resources. And with this came, of course, the need to maintain maritime trade routes and the need to develop a powerful navy, which would become very important as time went on. Let's go on to slide 8. So in the second part, we'll get into the resistance against Western dominance that came into the region, and then I'm going to, about halfway through, stop this and make sure that I save this. I don't want to tell you how many attempts I've made to record this lecture. I'm going to save this shortly and go on to another one. Anyway, let's go on to slide 9. The class system of traditional times was important into the 19th century and influenced how Japan reacted to the arrival of Western military power at mid-century. By 1900, the nation would be, in the words of Marius Jansen, transformed into a nation of commoners. But before that, it was quite the stratified society, with samurai placed high above the rest of the population. Now, amongst the samurai, there were many levels, and after the samurai were done away with, and the nation became one of commoners, as Jansen put it, there still was a high elite that came from the previous high elite. But the point was that these 4 categories you see in slide 9 were no longer as important as they'd been. The samurai had been on fixed stipends for some time, which were fine through the maybe 1830, 1840s. But then, as the economy changed, these stipends became less and less, and eventually they were taken away. Which was, but their swords were not taken away, and that was the cause of some of the violence we'll discuss in a few slides after this, the violence of the 1860s that greatly affected society. As for the peasants, they were in a pickle. Peasants are always in a pickle in traditional history and beyond. Their villages were taxed as a unit, and they were split up into 5 family units within villages to be watched as a group and to have mutual responsibility. There was a system of some parallel in China called the Baojia system, where families were mutually responsible for each other. If one did something wrong, then the others would suffer. Taxes went up and up during the period of the early 19th century and eventually approached 50%. And this was a contributing factor to revolts in the 1820s and 30s by peasants that went on to the 1880s. In the readings, Beasley also notes that political sophistication was growing during this time amongst village leaders and other peasants in the early 19th century, which promoted the beginning of a single culture that would eventually replace that of the individual daimyos. Let's go on to slide 10. So the establishment had a lot left in them, in spite of the fact that their power was dissolving over the decades. And I have to say that these developments took decades, and that's something we have to remember, that change did not come in just a few years. It took many, many years. So pay attention to these dates as we go. So reforms of a sort were pursued to start with in 1790 by the intellectual samurai Matsudaira, who's on this slide. Everybody, by the way, you see as a historical figure, they have pigeon perches all over Japan, just like Theodore Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln are everywhere in the United States. His reforms helped, but did not really forestall any of the problems we're going to be discussing, because they were intended to refurbish and refresh Confucian-style government, and this did not prevent internal unrest, and it certainly did not help to arm Japan to face the hitherto unimagined threat of a newly lethal kind of foreign military. Okay, I'm stopping here before I lose this audio, and we'll do a part 2, starting with slide 11.